Hello, everyone. We had a minor technical issue a few moments ago. I'm not sure if you heard me the first time or not, so I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce us. Welcome to the Bride of Cyclops Con, Finding the New Edge in Fantasy Fiction. With me today are a panel of professional and established sword and sorcery writers, and we're all going to be talking about the crafting of this wonderful fiction that we enjoy reading and writing. First, we're going to introduce ourselves, and I'm Howard Andrew Jones, the editor of Tales from the Magician's Skull, as well as the writer of the De Nassim stories and the For the Killing of Kings, the trilogy there, and numerous other short fiction pieces. Going around the room, let's start with Violette. Why don't you tell us who you are, Violette?
Hello, I'm Violette Malan. I write several other things besides sword and sorcery, but my sword and sorcery books are feature the characters Dylan and Parno. So I call them my Dylan and Parno series. So that's very easier to find that way.
Very good. Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan Long. I wrote 11 novels for the Warhammer people. Wait, I've got one. Shaman Slayer. I did 5 Gotrek and Felix novels, 3 Ulrika the Vampire novels. Then I have my own sword and laser series, Jane Carver of War. So lots of swashing and lots of buckling.
Good. Clint?
Well, my name is Clint Lee Werner. I write mainly under C.L. Werner. And like Mr. Long, I've written, I think, almost 30 books for Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, and Warhammer 40K at this point. Last year, I was fortunate enough to do an official Solomon Kane story. And my upcoming book is a Legends of Asgard story novel for Aconite called The Sword of Surtur. So I'm adding Marvel to the list of accomplishments.
Very nice. And we have James Enge.
Hi, I'm James Enge. I've written a lot of fiction, and some of it has even been published. The published stuff is almost exclusively sword and sorcery. The character I write about most often is Morlock Ambrosius, who is the son of Merlin Ambrosius, but they don't get along. He's also got scoliosis, a limp, and he's an alcoholic. I figure, he can do a lot of stuff, so I figure I want to overload him with kryptonite. And the first novel, Blood of Ambrose, was nominated for a World Fantasy Award and a Prix Imaginal in France. Of course, when I say nominated, I mean it didn't win. And there's 5 more of them and a bunch of short stories, some of which are still appearing in Tales from the Magician's Skull. I guess I got a story coming out next year in fantasy and science fiction. That's a big win for me. So anyway, that's me.
Very nice.
And this is my dog, Dog Detective Lenny Briscoe. He'll be in and out, but he doesn't write.
Okay, good. And lastly, John Krasaki.
Hi, I'm John C. Hocking, Chris. I wrote Conan and the Emerald Lotus and its time-lost sequel, Conan and the Living Plague. I co-edited the anthology Detroit Noir for Koch Books, and I've written a small stack of sword and sorcery short stories. I've been a fan of the forum since I could read.
You got your start reading Conan Marvel comics, didn't you?
Now, the very first one I read was in 1967. I read People of the Black Circle and The Lancer, Conan the Adventurer.
Oh, wow.
It blew my little mind.
How little was that mind at the time?
Well, I was 7, so yeah, it was pretty small.
Wow.
Nothing was the same after that. The villains in conventional children's fiction didn't cut it after that. They didn't seem frightening at all.
The Boxcar Children didn't have to face anyone like that.
The Hardy Boys, man. No decapitations. There's no demonic creatures from outside. It didn't work out. I had to leave that behind.
Well, I don't want to take a whole bunch of time defining sword and sorcery because the panel is only an hour long, and frequently just you can do an entire panel discussion on what exactly sword and sorcery is and isn't. So our technical wizard Thorns already posted in a link to the Twitch feed, and I thought that I would read a real quick touch on a few points about sword and sorcery, and then we'll just get to discussing the writing of it. So as far as we here at the Skull are concerned, I'm not sure if this represents everyone seated with me right now, but I mean the editorial staff and the publisher. There's 4 points we're really thinking that define sword and sorcery. Briefly, the environment. Sword and sorcery fiction takes place in lands different from our own, where technology is relatively primitive, allowing the protagonists to overcome their martial obstacles face to face. Magic works, but seldom at the behest of the heroes. More often, sorcery is just one more obstacle used against them and is usually wielded by villains or monsters. The landscape is exotic, either a different world or far corners of our own. So that's environment. The protagonists. The heroes live by their cunning or brawn, frequently both. They're usually strangers or outcasts, rebels imposing their own justice on the wilds or the strange and decadent civilizations which they encounter. They're usually commoners or barbarians. Should they hail from the highest ranks of society, then they are discredited, inherited, or come from the lower ranks of the nobility, the lowest of the high. Obstacles. Sword and sorcery's protagonists must best fantastic dangers, monstrous horrors, and dark sorcery to earn riches, astonishing treasure, the love of dazzling members of the opposite sex, or the right to live another day. Always something that we should look forward to. And 4, structure. Sword and sorcery is usually crafted with traditional structure. Stream of consciousness, slice of life, or any sort of experimental narrative effects, when they appear, are methods used to advance the plot rather than ends in themselves. A tale of sword and sorcery has a beginning, middle, and end, a problem and solution, a climax and resolution. Most important of all, sword and sorcery moves at a headlong pace and overflows with action and thrilling adventure. And real briefly, do any of our panelists want to add to that?
I like Joe McCullough's definition that sword and sorcery is fantasy with dirt. I know that nowadays even epic fantasy is filled with dirt, but I think we were doing it first. That it's there awkward things happen. It's we're dealing with a different class of people than palaces usually, and even there it's the seamy side of a palace, like in Swords of Lankhmar. So yeah.
I think one of the things that we find happens a lot is that the protagonists don't have there's no real happy ending. There's nothing that lasts. Most of the time with sword and sorcery, in my experience, we've had series characters, either in short stories or novellas or novels, and they continue being whoever it is they are as the series progresses, in that if they become rich, they lose the money somehow. If they escape their enemy, it's only to encounter the enemy again in a different place. Their lives never get easier, and they don't end up retired in a nice, comfortable place. And I think that's got to be part of the protagonists, the description of the protagonist.
I tend to think of sword and sorcery as being keyed as much to pacing as anything else. A lot of modern fantasy courses at great length and with a lot of emphasis upon world building and characterization. Not to have anything against that, but at a certain point, I think world building, characterization, and other concerns outweighs the actual story itself. Sword and sorcery tends to move forward. The plot develops, things happen, sometimes with startling speed. It's more in common maybe with hard-boiled crime fiction. That's what draws me to sword and sorcery. I like the propulsive feel of the narrative, which you oftentimes don't get in conventional fantasy.
I've often said, I've written several articles based on the fact that, in my opinion, sword and sorcery and hard-boiled fiction are almost two halves of a coin.
Agreed.
Or two faces. And I don't think I'm wrong in suggesting that they appeared more or less at the same time. You know, if we go back to the pulp magazines.
Very close indeed. Yeah, 100% correct. Preach on.
One of my favorite quotes, besides Joe McCullough's about about just fantasy writing in general, is from a guy named John C. Hocking, who said, "Action is character." So that's one of the things I like about it too, is that that really lit up inside my skull when I read that, Chris, because one of the things I like about the kind of fiction that we write is that it's not all somebody looking in the mirror and describing themselves. I mean, things happen and the people involved matter, but it's displayed in conduct, what they're actually doing, which is always a more convincing way to show character anyway. So anyway, I think that's also one of the great quotes.
Nathan, did you want to chime in?
I think in response to the post that you made yesterday on Facebook, I said that I had always called sword and sorcery working class fantasy, because it's always about the people that are doing things, not the people that are running things. It's always like soldiers, mercenaries, thieves, people who got to do this to make the next day's bread. And there may be princes and princesses and kings and politicians in it, but they're usually the enemy, or at least antagonists, and they're usually the ones that are making life hard for your heroes, and the heroes have to fight. And the other thing about sword and sorcery is that it's always an unequal battle. The hero is always the underdog going against, like, the hero has no magic. The sorcerer that they're going against has all the magic, and somehow the hero still wins.
Clint, did you want to say anything?
I think to echo some of what Nathan just said, it's kind of a case of scale and intimacy. You're right there with the heroes. It's a direct action. They're not several steps removed with this epic sweeping scope that's across the entire world. It's usually just one or two kingdoms or one city or one tower. And because the scale is so much lesser, you've got a more direct involvement with the hero. I've always likened it to, you're worried about Frodo going through Mordor, but you're directly involved with Conan going through the Tower of the Elephant.
Definitely. Well, why don't we talk, we're kind of already talking a little bit about structure. What are some of the features that you try to build into your story when you, before you set the pen to paper or your fingers at the keyboard? What are you trying to do when you structure your tale?
But going off of one of the things that Clint said, to me, if it's sword and sorcery, you're probably not jumping POVs. You're sticking with one person. You're sticking with, at least for me, you're sticking with the hero, and you're seeing everything from the hero's point of view, rather than, like, that seems to be one of the tropes of epic fantasy, is that you have like 5 different characters that you're following through some giant plot. Sword and sorcery is direct and sticks with one hero or one band of heroes as they go through things, and you learn about what's happening through them. You don't know in advance what's happening. So, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense.
I think the length. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the length of the work has to do with that too. If you've got a short story, it's easy to keep it focused on one person. If you're writing one of the nowadays, in the old days, a novel was like 40, 50,000 words sometimes. That's still technically a novel according to SFWA. Nowadays, if it's not 100,000 words, a lot of publishers won't even look at it. And then there, of course, there's supposed to be a whole series of them, 15 or 20 of them. So in a narrative that massive, you can't stick to one point of view, and that does diminish the intimacy of the connection to the characters. So yeah, I mean, there are pluses as well as minuses. You can see more things, more kinds of things can happen, but there is a reduction of intensity, I think. The longer the thing gets, the more has to come in and disrupt that relationship between the reader and the main character.
Sorry.
What I was going to say is that since I have two main characters, even in short stories, I am switching from the one point of view to the other. But it isn't until they appear in novels that I start having to include, and it really is a case of having to include some of the other people, because things do happen off stage. So in some ways you do, and there's also the getting to the 100,000 words. You got to get there somehow. But as I say, if you've got two protagonists, for me it's the epitome is Fawford and the Grey Mouser, and sometimes you have it from Fawford's point of view, and sometimes the Grey Mouser, and there you go.
Right. He'll occasionally bounce into the other's head for a little bit, but each story in the Lankhmar series is basically from primarily one point of view. Usually the Mouser, which I found strange after I read that Leiber himself identified most closely with Fawford, but that he usually wrote from the Mouser's point of view. Anyway, Chris and Clint, we're still waiting on you. Clint, what do you have to say?
Well, I think it really kind of highlights the scope of the genre that it seems to flourish in short fiction. Series characters, tales that maybe are 10,000 words, even less. Whereas some of the longer novels, at times, they rather struggle to sort of maintain that feel while having this elongated word count, getting into 80, 100,000 words. I think that's one of the reasons I enjoyed Chris's Conan novel so much, is because he managed to make it still feel like something that would have been in Weird Tales back in the day, which even some of the better entries in the Tor series didn't manage that. They were fun reads, but they didn't feel authentic.
That's one of the same reasons I was enjoying Emerald Lotus so much that I stopped halfway through and found a way to contact the dude who wrote it. Anyway, go on, Chris.
I think that Sword and Sorcery tends to focus on specific, heroic, semi-heroic, anti-heroic, some central character. So generally, yeah, you're going to see it from their point of view, or at least watch them as they interact and learn about them. And that's part of the fascination, is you usually have some sort of striking character at the center of it. And again, the longer the work, the more likely you're going to need, the more complicated the plot, the more likely you might need other POVs in order to get the story across to the reader and maybe show the reader what your main character is like when viewed through other eyes. But yeah, I could see the focus basically being on one person, one main character or two main characters primarily. I think that's most effective for this kind of story. It looks that way.
The guy I write most about doesn't talk much. So there always has to be another character, because, they say 100,000 words and then more or less says, eh. To shift the focus from one to the other is sometimes work for me. But yeah, you're right. Other characters can provide contrast, sort of clear the air from the fog that can be in one person's mind. Yeah.
I was reading something from Roger Zelazny the other day, and he says he said, obviously, the rule of three. You need three characters because to have a tug of war. You need three cool ideas. And the third one is you've got to have the setting. So you've got the characters, the ideas, and the setting makes up the third one. So this is kind of what we're getting to with the point about there have to be occasionally more than the one or the two characters, because you do have to have some kind of contrasting, and or as Zelazny expressed it, a tug of war.
For the setting, I like. I'm sorry, I forget who I. I like impossible stuff. You know, if something impossible isn't happening, then my interest diminishes. So I like that. I like if something impossible isn't happening, I make it happen. And I worry about the world building and how it fits in to the magic system and all that stuff later.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll shut up.
Oh, you don't need to shut up. We're here to talk. We have a viewer, and I think it's a friend of ours, saying several point of views contribute to an annoying experience of sometimes feeling distracted by characters that might interest you less than others. And I completely agree. I think we have all experienced that. We're reading a novel we're really enjoying, and then the point of view switches, and you're like, oh man, I got to slog through chapters featuring that character again. Right? Whereas if you're reading one with, either a duo or a single character for the most part that you're really interested in, if you like that character, great. If you don't like that character, you're not reading the series, So it's. Yeah. Speaking of characters, how do we go about constructing a great sword and sorcery or heroic fiction character? What do you think is important? Chris, why don't you lead off?
It's a bit challenging. I started off trying to write about Conan, so as writing about a legend, writing about a mythic character. What I wanted to do was create slightly after writing about Conan was write more grounded, more realistic characters, less legendary, less mythic, more like people you might know. And so I tried to come up with characters that I could fit into stories with maybe a similar pulpy level of thrills that were more grounded, more easily to identify with. And again, taking a cue, I think, from hard-boiled crime fiction, trying to put them into more realistic situations of conflict that didn't necessarily involve like earth-shaking magics, but rather conflicts between criminals of various sorts, maybe supernatural criminals and supernatural creatures. So coming up with a character that was interesting enough to try to, you could see them maybe overshadowed by the supernatural elements of the sword and sorcery story, and struggling to try to understand what was going on and overcome. That was some of the impetus there.
James?
That's a tricky one. I guess I'm bored by perfection. If somebody is the most awesome at something, they should be bad at something else. There has to be a way for them to get in trouble. One of the things I love about Fafhrd and the Grey Monster, apart from everything, is that they, they're both imperfect in different ways. And so they, as Leiber says somewhere, they're two fragments of a greater hero. So the monster is little and irritable. Fafhrd is a tall drunk. To make sure that they have some sort of thing that gives them trouble. Because all the exterior trouble, gigantic monsters, snakes coming from everywhere, there's a limited kind of danger involved there. Because, if you have a big enough sword and the author is on your side, the character is at limited danger. But if there's some kind of psychological, emotional, spiritual threat through the character's own flaw, that creates more risk and a different category of risk. So sometimes you can solve the exterior problem, but that interior problem doesn't get solved, which is kind of what you were talking about, Violette.
I had that experience in when I was writing for Warhammer. Like a lot of their characters, particularly in the game, are very one-note superheroes. And so when I was asked to create a series for Warhammer, that is the first thing that I did. Is I said, I'm not going to do that. And I pitched them the Dirty Dozen in Warhammer. and so it was a bunch of very flawed criminals who go on an adventure.
Great.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
So, because I couldn't, writing a book about a virtuous knight who is virtuous all the time and always wins is the most boring thing in the world. So writing about a bunch of criminals who don't want to be there, don't want to have the adventure, and are trying desperately to get out of it at all times is so much more fun and so much more interesting to me. So, what James was saying, I learned all these lessons from Fritz Leiber and Fafhrd the Grey Mouser, because I had read Conan before I read Fafhrd the Grey Mouser, and I went, okay, this guy's all right, but he's also not human. He's a force of nature. And that's not as interesting to me as these two human guys who are, they may be the two best swordsmen in this and any world, but they're also just completely at the mercy of their own stupidity and appetites. So that was so much more fun.
My characters are always broke.
Yeah.
I think of the two best thieves in Lankmar, the Leiber story, where they come back with the riches from Stardock, and they kind of have a falling out, but they agree with each other that they're the two best thieves of Lankmar. And then, spoilers if the audience hasn't read it, but it turns out that they're better thieves than they are. And they both get robbed and they end up broke again. I wrote an article about that, which I presented at conference, but it's never been published, called The Two Worst Thieves in Lankmar, because whatever they get, they have to lose, because there's got to be another Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser story.
Exactly.
Violet, yeah, you were just going to say something about that. Well, you did say something about that. Yeah, your characters
I
always
did, yeah.
But what,
They always, in a sense, we're like just touching on structure again for a minute. It's almost a circular structure, because in many ways the characters will end up more or less the same place that they started, which is looking for a job, looking for a place to rob, on the way somewhere else. But when you end the story, they'll be looking for a job, looking for something to steal, and so on, because somehow they're just never successful.
now your characters are mercenaries.
Yes.
So they're always looking for a job, but they've got a lion on a job. They're not scrabbling like some of these other characters.
Well, I think with my characters, I made them mercenaries because I thought if I made them thieves, it would be too obvious that I was cribbing from Leiber.
Yeah.
So I made them mercenaries. But then I thought I didn't want to get into the typical mercenary trope that the mercenaries are bad guys. So my mercenaries are sort of samurais and musketeers at the same time. So they're very respected, but nobody likes them. So they're very solitary. They don't live among the rest of the people, except of course they're looking for work all the time. And somehow my particular mercenaries, Dylan and Parno, they keep picking the wrong people to work for.
Someone's working against them.
Yeah. How about you, Clint? What do you want to say about character? What do you think we need to
I actually had the opposite experience recently. I wrote about one of the most stalwart, pure characters you could ever imagine. I did a story with Sir Galahad, who I would argue is, you always hear the term Mary Sue thrown around. I'd say he was actually the original Mary Sue. He's introduced to the Arthurian mythos later on. He's, the son of Lancelot and the wife that you never heard of before. He replaces Percival in the Grail legend. So when you have a character like that who is supposed to be so pure and perfect and everything else, I think the best flaw you can give him is he doesn't think he's enough. So he's actually constantly striving to be more because he doesn't feel he's living up to his own legend. At least that was my solution to writing probably the most difficult character I've ever tried to tackle.
There you go. And of
Brilliant.
course, you give him a difficult frame of supporting characters who may be providing with distorted information, I suppose.
Well, you have to have something there to act almost like a contrast. You know, I think that's why you get sort of the everyman approach in so much of your superhero fiction.
Well, speaking of that, then we also have to be thinking, yes, you got to have an interesting character for your protagonist, but what about the villains? I think villains are always important, but in sword and sorcery, they're colorful and powerful. They hold all the cards usually. What makes a good sword and sorcery villain?
I know a lot of times when I do the Shintaro Oba stories, I start out picking a monster out of Japanese folklore and figuring out, okay, now how can we do something cool with this?
So you just go straight, okay, what kind of cool monster can I use? And then how can I pull a story off of that? What's related to it? I like it. Nathan, what's your method?
Well, my sort of philosophy in life is that the quality or filth. So I usually make the villain rich or noble and or superhumanly with supernaturally endowed, so that whatever their scheme is going to not affect other rich people, but is going to affect common people. So it's always about how little they care for people, and also it's always fun to have somebody who is very good at justifying what they're doing. Because you don't want somebody who's just like, whoa, because like nobody thinks of themselves that way. They always think that they're doing something important and good. And
everybody's the hero of their own story.
Yes.
Everyone he's saying is the hero of their own story.
Right on.
That's right. Yep. So, for the Jane Carver books, the first of the Jane Carver books, the villain in that would be the hero in any other story. He's the big jock with a big smile, a big sword, and everybody loves him, and he's a complete son of a bitch. And Jane has to, not only defeat him physically, but it has to sort of defeat his popularity. So,
Violet, how do you design your villains?
If I'm writing the short Dylan and Parno short stories, my villains are invariably mages of some kind or another, because they have a history of running into problems with mages. And, essentially I get to do that. Oh my God, it's another mage, like who? And so I'm playing around with that. And but I really like this idea of finding a monster in folklore and creating a villain out of it. I think that's something I'm going to steal from you and give it a try.
How about you, James? You have a really interesting and different villain this next time in the upcoming issue of The Skull.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if you guys have seen the M. Night Shyamalan movie, Unbreakable.
Yes.
Which is about heroes and villains. And one of the most important characters in the movie says to the hero, no, actually, it's his mom. But anyway, says that there are two kinds of villain in comic books. There's the soldier hero who fights the soldier villain who fights the hero with his body. And then there's the scientist villain who fights the hero with his mind. And I kind of apply that to sword and sorcery, because you got monsters, which are, usually physical threats, although not always. And then you've got, suave, brilliant characters who are an antagonist at a different level. So usually, I find that my villains are either a monster / soldier villain, or one of these mad scientists, except it's not science because it's magic. So yeah. Although sometimes it looks like one and it turns out to be the other. Those are the ones I think I like the best. When it looks like it's a person, but it's actually a monster, or vice versa.
Chris?
Well, it did occur to me that almost all of my villains were really arrogant, people who are very easily capable of putting their own wants, needs, desires, over everyone around them. They could be in any position at all. They could be rich, poor, mages, normal people, warriors, what have you. But they easily saw themselves in their own position as being, everyone else was subservient to their own needs. They were narcissistic, arrogant individuals. So that's where, obviously, that galls me, because my villains almost always fit into there somewhere. But most of my villains show up in the story because I was thinking along the lines of adding an element of supernatural horror to my story. Sword and sorcery almost always has a strong element of supernatural horror. It's one of my favorite things about it. So I'll be knocking myself out, trying to think of something particularly horrible. And then I would try to imagine who would use or benefit or be, somehow connected to this horrific thing I've dreamed up. And my villains will crawl up out of that.
You raise an interesting point about the horror. And that gets me thinking about magic. And it also gets me thinking of the fact that one of the things that I think all of us enjoy about sword and sorcery that are our own creations is that we can come up with stuff that doesn't sound like it came from somebody's monster manual or player's handbook. Now, I'm a gamer from way back. I enjoy the role-playing games, but I don't want my fiction, unless it's tied in with someone's game world, I don't want my fiction to read like it came out that way. So I work hard to try and make the magic feel weird and different and then a little alarming. So, for instance, when I do write the De Beer and Nassim stories, it has to have a Middle Eastern flair based loosely on folklore, kind of like the monsters that Clint was mentioning for his Fantastic Japan. How do you guys go about striking the right tone with the weird magics and horrors that you conjure up? Violet, since the screen's on you.
I think what I tend to do is I find people's minds more frightening than anything else. So for me, the horror comes from finding out that the person you've been talking to either isn't a person, isn't who you thought they were, or what you thought they were. It's that more than a physical encounter, if I can put it that way. It has to be mental horror for me.
Makes sense. Nathan?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. When I write magic, I don't tend to write big, flashy magic. Like people are not generally throwing fireballs unless it's Warhammer, and then people are always throwing fireballs. I like stuff I like magic that is subtler, that might not be noticed, like by the populace at large, but it's definitely affecting the hero. I came up with a gag for the third Blackheart's book and it's like, if I can come up with something that creates an impossible thing for the hero to overcome, that's sort of prime for me. So like in the third Blackheart's book, the villain of the piece does a spell and puts these eyes on the chest of the hero so that they give them They give them a job to do and say, you cannot betray me because through these eyes I can hear and see everything that you do. And so they have to figure out a way to still communicate with each other so that the person who's listening doesn't know what they're saying. So it's like, I mean, in a science fiction or in a contemporary, that would be just like a microphone, I guess. But it just like this, trying to come up with something that not only scares you or is creepy, but actually affects the plot, affects what the hero does in some way.
Chris, looks
That
like
was a terrible answer. Anyhow.
No, that was a fascinating.
Oh,
answer.
no.
What do I go on?
Chris, were you raising your hand to speak, or
No, I was just being pensive. I was
just
thinking.
pensive, look at mind melt kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm still very much enthralled to the sort of the weird tales, supernatural style of storytelling. I'll usually think up the supernatural element in the story, usually first, and the story will be twisted around it. So it's as far as it has to be an integral part of the story. There can be magic or supernatural elements that aren't tied directly to the central plot line, but in Sword and Sorcery, I think a strong element of the basic plot should be, sorcery or supernatural in nature. And oftentimes I'll think of it in terms of a horror story. I'll think of whatever the supernatural element is as how can I make this as frightening as possible? How can I make it as horrific as possible? And then how can I put my protagonist in a situation where he is really up against it in facing such a thing?
James, your character is different, I think, than many of the others we talked about because he's doing a whole lot of sorcery himself. Now, typically he's crafting it, which is a different kind of sorcery than the fireball kind, but he himself is a sorcerer, and I think most of the rest of us aren't writing from the viewpoints of sorcerers. How do you go about with your constructing your magic and your monsters?
Well, one thing that I resist is the idea of a magic system, because if a universe is complicated, there's more than one scholium trying to explain different parts of it. We don't have a science system. We've got the fields of chemistry, physics, biology, different kinds of study for different kinds of things. So I don't want everything to be resolvable to a single system. I think that actually makes it less realistic and less impactful.
It also makes it less frightening, I think.
I think so too. Like the elevator operator says in the David S. Pumpkin sketch, to the mind, the unexplained is the most terrifying thing. And so it's not weird, and it's not disturbing. It's not weird fiction if everything in it can be explained, as if magic were science. So I like disruptive things that someone doesn't expect, that they don't understand, even if they're learned in magic. And one of my big models, apart from Liber, is Jack Vance and the Kugel the Clever stories. So there's a lot of magic in those stories. Usually Kugel doesn't understand it, and he thinks he does, which makes it worse usually. But there's a lot of magic in those stories. But it's all just beyond the bounds of the explainable or the possible. So sort of randomizing things by breaking patterns and trying to create something more disturbing. I think that's the best kind of magic to use in a story like this.
Clint, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that has always stuck in my head was Arthur Macon's approach to magic, which is that even at its most benign, it's still a violation of the natural order, the natural world. So no matter what you're doing with it, it still should have this creepy, sort of grotesque aspect to it, where it's not something you really want to be messing around with. Even if your intentions are good, what you're using to get there is just so nasty, it's got these repercussions to it. Not that I've always been able to write it that way, because with the Age of Sigmar stuff, it's very much high fantasy, so very magic-oriented setting. So a lot more, flippant uses of spells and that kind of thing, which really I prefer when there's consequences. It's not something that you just use flippantly.
That brings up a good point. When I was writing, so I wrote 4 novels for the Pathfinder line, and James Sutter, the editor of the line at the time, had told me he knew that I loved sword and sorcery. He wanted it to have more of a gritty sword and sorcery feel. But when I started writing for the line, my characters would die and they weren't carrying around healing potions. And that's how I used to run my games. Magic was more low fantasy than high fantasy, but I kept getting complaints from readers like, hey, how come I can't believe that they don't have a cleric with them? Why aren't they using healing magic? So they wanted the high fantasy feel. Apparently that was their default understanding for how game fiction and how fantasy ought to sound. And so I started including clerics, then getting them killed off early. So it's just kind of, because I still wanted to tell I wanted the characters in jeopardy. I didn't want, like you're saying, the high fantasy stuff to creep in. I can't believe that we've almost been talking about this for an hour. It seems like we could keep going. I think we ought to discuss an elephant in the room, and that is that we're going back to a well, and we frequently have to contend with the fact that fiction written in another time had different understandings about the roles of different peoples in society. And so I've had some people suggest that if we're writing sword and sorcery, then we're going to, we must be celebrating some of these more unpleasant things. How do we approach sword and sorcery and bring it forward without completely transforming it? Obviously, we just avoid racism, right? We empower female characters, but what more can we do? Is it that simple? What can we avoid? What can we do to bring more people to appreciate this writing?
Representation is important because I forget who it was. It's some fairly eminent fantasy writer imagined an alternate reality where the Americas had not been inhabited before European settlers arrived there. And for this writer, it was a way to imagine the American colonial past without American colonial oppression. But of course, it did so by erasing from reality an entire class of human being that turned out to be a mistake, strategically. But I think that if we create worlds where everybody looks the same, unconsciously, that reinforces some of the tropes from the past that we'd like to leave behind. And I also think it's bad world building. It's a small world where everybody looks the same and everybody has the same language and everybody believes the same thing. It should be to create at least the illusion of a bigger world. You should have lots of different kinds of people. And that actually by itself solves a lot of problems.
Absolutely.
I have seen occasionally arguments that we should be writing worlds where the problems of oppression and the problems of underrepresentation and sexism and those things do not exist, because we should be imagining better worlds. And I see that there is value in that, but for me, my writing is almost always, whatever else it is always commenting on the world that is. And sort of, because I like that, I like stories that are going to highlight things that I think are terrible. I also like satire. So like, I am always going to be representing, even in fantasy worlds, I'm always going to be representing the fact that these things exist: racism, sexism, and class stratification, and the oppression of the lower classes. Those all exist in the real world, so I feel like I should address them in my writing.
Okay. Violet?
That what often happens with sexism is that, especially for women, many of us don't want to write a story about how terrible the plight of women either is or was, depending on how you want to look at it. And for some people, that's the story. It's how the person overcomes this kind of oppression. But for a lot of us, we want to imagine a world where that oppression doesn't exist, or it has been already taken care of. Because otherwise, I find that a lot of people feel, and I think I have to agree to some extent, that you're limiting the what your characters can do. Now, it's interesting to put them, if they've got, if like my characters come from a society where there is no sexism, but they sometimes visit places where there is. So because my characters are male and female, this creates some interesting situations for them to be in. But other than that, I'm of the school that there's no sexism in my stories.
Clint, any thoughts?
I think the key is you have to be true to the characters and true to the setting that you're portraying. So, touching on what Nathan and Violet were talking about, if you ignore the ugliness that was there, you're actually disrespecting the people that have gone through it. For instance, if I was writing something set in Arizona in the 1850s, nobody liked an Apache. It didn't matter if you're a Mexican, a gringo, or a Pima. Nobody liked an Apache, and from their perspective, they had every reason not to. The Apaches were raiding and, stealing from everybody. So to ignore that aspect of what was going on at the time is doing a disrespect to people that actually lived through the era. And I think even if you're creating a world out of whole cloth, you have to address what has happened in the setting. So if the dwarves and the elves have this long history of resentment and stuff, you can point out why it's wrong, but you also can't ignore that it's there.
That's one of my big beefs with Tolkien, actually. When I was reading The Hobbit, as far as I'm concerned, the dwarves are the good guys. They were Bilbo's friends. And they go through Mirkwood, and they get kidnapped and imprisoned by elves who want their money. Okay, I think I know what's going on here. Those are the bad guys. But Tolkien explains in a direct address to the reader that no, the elves they are and remain, and that is good people. And I said, no! But he didn't hear me. But that's if you're going to and what I guess my point is that if you're going to represent a conflict like that in a story, you can't put your thumb on the scale as the writer and say these guys are the good guys. You got to be more realistic and say this is why it happened and this is why people act this way, but without endorsing a point of view. I guess there can be forces of evil and stuff. I'm not arguing against that. That's part of the real world too. But I think more often that these system of oppressions grow up because of historical causes that can be understood. And when we're making the world, we're responsible for all its features. So it bears some thinking about, that's all.
Makes sense.
Well, I have written fiction where the issues of sexism primarily are addressed. It just doesn't happen to come up in any of my sword and sorcery stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, any thoughts?
It's a challenging topic for me because I wouldn't want my stories to be didactic in any way, shape, or form. Anything I feel about justice, injustice, right, wrong, vice, virtue, prejudice has to be woven into the warp of the story. And you could probably tell how I feel about these things, but openly addressing these sort of, I'm not interested in openly addressing these sort of things in the story itself as a general rule. You know, aside from the arrogance I mentioned earlier, which could be depicted in a bunch of different ways. Human evil, I would address, but specifically, I think most people read this sort of stuff to take a couple steps away from a sort of blatant confrontation with modern political and social difficulties. And so, if they're there in my stories, they're meshed in deep enough so that I don't think they stand out as any sort of object lesson in how to behave or live.
Well, I don't think any of us would argue with the idea that the story is king. Everything that you're doing is in the service of the story.
Right on.
So there you have it.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
don't think any of us are trying to advocate message fiction in the kind of message that beats you over the head with it. I don't know how many of our viewers grew up watching the original Star Trek the way I did. I don't know if anyone watched it as much as I did. But, there are good episodes. I happen to like the Doomsday Machine best. The whole thing's an analogy about a weapon that just ends up destroying both sides. It was a nuclear war metaphor that, as a kid, I didn't even get. It was just a great action story. Or you've got the one where you've got people who are half black on one side, half white on the other, but on different sides, and they're fighting a race war to the death. One of them is a subtle message that happens to be a great action story. It has a little more depth if you think about it. The other one is beating you over the head with the message. And I much prefer the more subtle version of message fiction than the larger. Tell me the story first, and it happens to have some depth to it, great. Don't pick out your message and then put a story around it. That's
Even Frank Gorshin couldn't save that one.
Yeah. We are about out of time. Real quickly, I wondered if anyone wanted to pass on there's so much more advice we could pass on, but a favorite point or two that you guys would want to share with our audience about writing, how you go about writing sword and sorcery, a mistake that you made that you wish you had someone explain to you before you started. Go for it. And Chris, I'll start with you.
Write about your own characters and finish what you write.
Sure. James.
Write what you want to read. I see people straining after effect of stuff that they think is cool, but they wouldn't necessarily want to read that fiction themselves. You should write what you want to read, and if it turns out not to be Nobel Prize winning stuff, that's okay. Someone will probably want to read it if you want to read it.
Clint?
I think the biggest thing is never expect your first draft to be perfect. I talk to so many aspiring writers that they are hung up on trying to get that first draft perfect. And it's like, no, you got to just finish a story.
Excellent point. Violet?
Just sort of leaping off of what Clint had to say, I once was not taking part in, but watching a panel of editors and authors, I think. And I think it was Tim Powers that said, professionals know they have to revise. Amateurs think they got it right the first time. So don't be afraid to revise your work, change it completely. Don't be afraid to do it.
That's when I have my most fun. The initial creative spurt and then the revision. It's so hard for me to get it down, but once I get it down, then I get to improve it. Yeah. Nathan.
There's a lot of different things, but I'll say one, which is this is sort of going back to what James said, don't try to create a voice for your fiction. your voice will come through no matter what you do. You cannot
Very important.
stop it. So just write the best you can, and your voice will develop naturally through writing.
Those are all great points. I'll toss in one, and that is that mistake I used to make. Know what every one of your characters wants before the scene begins. It's almost like you're the film director, reminding everyone what their motive is before you say, okay, action. Get in your own head what everyone wants before you start writing dialogue. If it's an action scene, make sure you know what the monster's planning or the sorcerer is planning and what their capabilities are before, and then what the hero is going to try and improvise off of that. Just everyone's going to be thinking. All right. Well, guys and gals, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time.
It's nice to be able to put faces to some of the names that
Absolutely.
I've been looking
Agree.
at.
Guilty.
Great talking with you. Great.
A real pleasure. Well, thanks again for coming. I hope everyone enjoyed our talk.
Thanks, everybody.